Retro Future.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, it is I, Dankert Lexicon, and welcome to this anniversary special of Radio Retro Future. Yes, that's right, 10 years of costuming, vlogging, blogging, character design, and now also world building and even literature. And oh yes, we have much more to come, including our first Kickstarter. That's right, we are going to crowdfund for the first time in our 10-year existence. And with this Kickstarter, we are going to produce a coloring book for all ages with stories and scenes of the Association of Ishtar, including The Wrench in the Machine, and our upcoming book, Bound for the Styx. That's right, our second manuscript has been completed and will be off to the publisher in a few days at the moment of recording. To support our efforts, please go down to Kickstarter and press the Notify Me on Launch button to create some much needed hype for this project. But on with the video. What is steampunk? The question itself is already a meme. For starters, many steampunks will answer this question with another question. Are you familiar with Jules Verne? Have you seen Wild Wild West? And if you respond with no, they start scratching their heads themselves. On this channel, on the other hand, we are some of the horrible types of people who define words. But before we do that, why is steampunk so hard to explain to the layman? Well, because for most self-styled steampunks, steampunk is a thing they happen to like. If you like brass, it's steampunk. If they like Star Wars, that's steampunk. And if they like brown chocolate, you get the idea. In short, what steampunk is often projection. For those who are interested in the creative process, however, that's a bit more nuanced. On this blog, we use the word steampunk as a homonym that covers a range of topics. That's why I'll distinguish the following themes: the story genre, the aesthetic, and the community or scene/subculture. There are many similarities between them, but they all are different topics that need to be discussed separately. To fully understand the misunderstandings surrounding steampunk, we have to go back to the 1980s. When we talk about the history of steampunk, we are actually talking about the origins of the name. This is the main reason why I have this love-hate relationship with the word. For an explanation of this, I have to refer you to our previous videos. The term steampunks was coined by a cyberpunk author called K.W. Jeter, the author of Morlock Knights. In his letter to Locus magazine in 1987, he used it as a catch-all name for the stories he and his fellow authors had created, such as Tim Powers, who wrote The Anubis Gate. Bruce Sterling, who we'll mention later, described it as cyberpunk. In the past, cyberpunk was a very popular subgenre of science fiction at the time, but instead of exploring a galaxy of interstellar empires like in Star Trek set millennia into the future, cyberpunk takes place 5 minutes into the imminent century, in which hackers take on mega corporations and governmental overreach. It was therefore fitting that steampunk goes 5 minutes back into the past, to the Industrial Revolution, hence steampunk. The invention of the word inspired Bruce Sterling and William Gibson of Neuromancer fame to express this concept in the novel The Difference Engine from 1990. This is considered to be the first book to be written as a steampunk novel. And this is where my love-hate relationships resurfaces. The name steampunk is an invention of the 80s, and to label everything that comes before that as steampunk is just plain revisionism. So what about this book, The Difference Engine by Bruce Sterling and William Gibson? Well, it's an alternate timeline story in which Charles Babbage had successfully built the analytical engine in 1824, starting the digital revolution a century earlier. This makes the British Empire more powerful than it's ever been, as their navies and air fleets dominate the oceans. Also, a new class of so-called savants have emerged, whose existence has disrupted the social structure of the 19th century as we know it. The Difference Engine is seen as a literary milestone because its intent is different from previous books by the aforementioned authors. It was written as a steampunk, a alternate history where technological development was the linchpin in the deviation from the timeline. The above is also what I used for the definition of the steampunk genre, cyberpunk in the past. Like any other subgenre of science fiction, these are high-concept stories, stories whose premise can be boiled down to a simple scenario or what-if question. For example, a woman comes to the doctor, or what if the computer had been invented in the 19th century? These seem to be pretty clear descriptions, so why is there so much confusion? Well, steampunk has a fantasy sibling. Gaslamp fantasy is a term coined by the creators of Girl Genius, Phil and Katja Foglio. This is science fiction inspired fantasy with mad scientists, big robots, and insane inventions set in fantastical worlds. I don't know all that much about it because I'm not a fantasy fan. However, there's distinction between steampunk and gaslamp fantasy is rarely applied in practice by authors and consumers alike. It is hard to say when and where the first steampunk costumes appeared. Some claim it came from the DIY communities, others say it was conceived during sci-fi conventions, some say it started in England, others America, Japanese people think it was them. Regardless of its origin, it is certain that the aesthetic are Vero-Anglo-centric. There's a good reason for that, but more on that later. The phenomenon that we call steampunk today has been around since the 1990s, but the big explosion happened in 2012. Reason for this remains unclear. The steampunk community, with the exception of online communities, is unique because it can survive without sponsors. There is no Disney or any other companies that stocks the coffers of steampunk conventions. It's by the community, for the community. In fact, steampunk societies are located all over the world. These groups exchange ideas and traditions. So, for example, the infamous tea dueling is practiced all over the world, and parkours for teapot racing are built in various countries. There is even an International Steampunk Day on June 14th, the day Charles Babbage presented his plans of the Difference Engine to the Royal Society. There is also a separate music scene. So what is steampunk music, you ask? Well, steampunk music is what steampunk's like. My old friend Montague Jacques Fromage always says he is a familiar face within steampunk conventions, and that's certainly true for the music scene. Fitting metaphor though for the steampunk community as a whole, really. But if there's so much deviation among steampunks on what steampunk is, what brings these folks together? Why is steampunk clothing so often brown? I once asked on social media. After all that time, I seriously had no idea. I mean, nothing against the color brown itself, but it is pretty overdone. That aside, I've got several answers that quite frankly surprised me. Brown was associated with industry, obviously, but also sepia, or black and white photography, which I had no idea of. So I guess I learned something. History too is an important influence. However, it's not the history you learn in school. Most steampunks aren't particularly interested in that. I have tested this thesis. For example, during presentations, I asked my audience if they knew who Otto von Bismarck was, a very prominent politician in world politics who united a little European country now known as Germany. Perhaps one person in the audience raised their hand to say it was a World War II battleship. And this was before Sabaton made that song about it. Despite the fact that they rely on historical clothing and references, they do not know much about history. But if you ask them questions about characters like Frankenstein or writers like Jules Verne, they'll tell you how many times they've read their respective works. Point is, steampunks love pop history and pop culture. Go to Google and search for steampunk Disney or steampunk Insert your favorite character, and you'll find countless variations on these pop icons. The same goes for famous historical characters immortalized in movies like Lincoln. Same for the machines. The aesthetic for which steampunk is known can be traced directly to drawings in dime novels and penny dreadfuls of the 19th century, Disney movies, and now also anime and video games. Despite some people's claim that steampunk is a protest movement, its appearance has largely been popularized by Hollywood and Disney. And what does the average person know of the 19th century? Sepia pictures and steam engines. This is also why Victorian England is so popular in steampunk literature. It's the England of Sherlock Holmes, War of the Worlds, and Oliver Twist. It is why I always love when I hear steampunks must have steam engines. These people literally don't know better. This is different for artists such as the writers and builders of steampunk props. What appeals to many writers is the historical aspect, not only that of events, but also that of literature and film. Steampunks are the curators of pop culture in that regard. In terms of historical awareness, there's a great distance between those who care about the creative historical aspects of steampunk and those who care about the social or costume aspect of the culture. Do not get me wrong, I love bronze and brass, all the moving parts, and of course, steam! And for the ladies, there are beautiful dresses, and tough guys who can dress properly. And for the kids, Steampunk Batman! And maybe they'll learn why you can pick up a phone instead of activating it. When it comes to children, steampunk has an enormous potential in a range of fields, both creatively as educational and even help and pedagogy. Like in education for autistic children, as used by Bruce Rosenbaum of Mudvik. There are countless other expressions and applications of steampunk to explore, but that's why we have created the Steampunk Beginner's Guide. But what is steampunk really? Well, aesthetically, it has a nice balance between the strange and the familiar, making it accessible to a large audience. But it is also an amalgamation of hard sci-fi and playful fantasy. Those who can't appreciate history admire the technological or pop culture elements. It is not new or original. Rather, it's an anomaly. It's a phenomena that should not exist in today's commercial landscape. Nowadays, a lot of media gets created because, that's the mantra, people think they want more of the same. This is both the fault of the producers as the consumers. This stands in stark contrast to the early days of cinema. This is why many creators of the day are being inspired by the pop culture of the early 20th century, like Fritz Lang, Mary Shelley, and Jules Verne, and Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, Michael Moorcock. But what difference does that make, you ask? Well, let me explain. The writers and filmmakers of early pop culture are from an era when production companies were still young. Everything was unproven, everything had to be yet invented. So directors and writers were given a lot of freedom. It is no coincidence that many creative souls look with nostalgia at the 20th century. People spend way more time in public, so they dress well. Science was something magical. Technology seemed to have no boundaries, and there was still so much to discover in the world. Artists were pioneers of film and sound, and their bosses couldn't help but say, "Do what you want." These days, companies only dare to use proven formulas. Why do you think there are so many movies and series being re-released over and over again? It's no coincidence that there is a growing indie industry, that more and more people are rediscovering the works of Walter B. Gibson and Robert E. Howard, who created some of the first pop culture icons like The Shadow and Conan the Barbarian. That's what steampunk really is. An amalgamation of rediscovered literature and pop culture, archaic fashions and technologies that no longer have a place in our world, but still play a major part in our imaginations. Steam trains and biplanes might be obsolete. They deserve our admiration to remind us we are but dwarfs sitting on the shoulders of giants. But if that's too complicated, you can just state that steampunk is when goths discover brown. Hello everyone, I'm Bonsert Pokel, the creator of the Steampunk Beginner's Guide and the Association of Ishtar. Thank you so much for sticking with us till the end. 10 years have come and gone, and yeah, it's quite incredible to think where I started in 2012 and where we are now. Most notably is I published my first books, my first comic, and The Wrench in the Machine, which is behind you. Links are of course down below in the description. And yeah, if you want to celebrate this event with me, please get our books either on Amazon or send me an email for physical copies, also digital copies, by the way. And yeah, soon there also will be merchandise like these bookends, 3D printed resin models. I'm really happy with them. Also, these are hand painted by me. So yeah, if you are interested in that type of stuff, go subscribe to our website so you won't miss a single thing, like the release date of our upcoming book, Bound for the Sticks, which will be going to my publisher for approval very, very soon. So yes, and for all those who supported me throughout the years, thank you all so much. For the people who promoted this channel, for the people who've been guests on our podcast, people who have proofread my work, the artists that I'm currently working with for taking the time and their patience for helping me bring the world of the Association of Ishtar to life. Speaking of which, Kickstarter is coming pretty soon. So yeah, please subscribe to that page, create some hype, and yeah, and it's important because if this project is a success, we have an audience ready to support us for any other eventual Kickstarters like comic books or maybe art for the novels and stuff like that. So yeah, go check those out as well. Thank you very much. For all your support, and yeah, please tell your friends, family, and so on. And yeah, if you have suggestions for videos, stories, characters, merchandise, please let me know. And if that, for the next 10 years, make it your way. Good night.